So welcome to part 2 of the workshop training series, Equitable Teaching Strategies. And this is really just all about making sure everybody feels welcome in our workshops. So what's wrong? I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but we have a gender gap in computer science, technology, a lot of the STEM fields, and this is particular to computer science. So in the late 80s, women made up 37% of the computer science graduates, and in 2010, that went down to 18%. And you can see in the last 10 years, we've only grown to 21%. So this is like a big reason why Tech Girls exist, to bridge this gender gap. So what can we do? Luckily, there are quite a few things. And a lot of these are ways that we can reduce or mitigate things like implicit bias, stereotype threat, pigeonholing, imposter syndrome, and differential preparation. What we're really asking you to consider, and you might already be incorporating these, but we're really asking you to consider one area that you're really going to focus on or be more conscious of when you're doing your workshop. And we'll also have different readings and things if you want to take a deeper dive about any of these things. So, implicit bias. So for me, this is probably the biggest elephant in the room. It's when our subconscious treats something expected as good. We make these connections unconsciously based on schemata that our brains make. For instance, if we're in a room of adults and children, our brain might make a schema that tall people are more mature. And that pretty much works for that situation. But then what if you're in a group of adults and your brain applies the same schema? That's when it becomes a problem. Implicit bias often manifests itself when our brain is busy, overtaxed, or when we're distracted. And our brain looks for patterns to take the load off when we have to take the load off what we have to do consciously, but then we're unconsciously thinking, doing, and maybe even saying some things that we do not consciously realize is biased towards someone else. So what can we do? Well, one thing we can do is become aware of our own implicit bias. And this is not an easy thing. It requires a lot of work. And, one thing you can do is go online and go to Project Implicit and, kind of see things from that perspective. But I think a lot of this is just being open with family, friend, and peers to hear about when you might have done or said something that impacted them in a negative way, and being able to take that in and process it and figure out how you're going to change. So it's a big, these are not simple things to address. This is nice, creating a systematic process to make decisions. So especially I found this in the classroom, especially if we're getting into conversations or areas that might be more challenging. Having an algorithm that I knew that I could count on for how I'm going to deal with those situations. Like I'm not very good in the moment addressing hot topic issues. So I needed a way to say, oh, I hear you. This is something that's definitely, we need to talk more about. I need some time to process it. Let's come back and do it at this point. So having that sort of thing to go to. I also like this one a lot. This one is, what would someone else do? And it's a way to get our unconscious thoughts out into our conscious, because we have to think of it from the perspective of that person. And finally, I think this is really one of the easiest things that we can do, is promote a growth mindset and experimentation culture in computer science and STEM fields, because really that's what it's all about. Like failure is just really part of how we learn things, how we iterate on our designs, how we make things better. We're, almost never going to get something right the first time. And for a lot of students, that can be a different way of thinking about things, because they're so used to wanting to be right. And so I think this is a really, something that we definitely need to make sure in our workshops that participants understand that that's part of the process. All right, so reducing stereotype threat. And I'm going to read this because it's important, but I also never have gotten it right when I try to do it without reading it. So this occurs in the mind of a student or participant who is in a minoritized group when they are aware of a negative stereotype about that group and feel their performance could reflect poorly on the group as a whole in the minds of others. And this can occur even if the person who is thinking about the stereotype threat doesn't believe it. But if they believe somebody else believes it, it impacts their performance. So, and that's because, they're distracted and they can't focus on the task at hand. So the first thing to do is avoid raising stereotypes. And this can be as simple as overrepresenting one type of culture, pronouncing names incorrectly, using incorrect pronouns, or telling a joke that reinforces a stereotype. Avoid making students aware of being part of a minoritized group in a deficit manner. So just because a stereotype exists about a particular group, you do not need to be the one to bring it up. For instance, and I've done this before, I have said, girls are good at programming too. Well, that just implies that somebody thinks that girls aren't good at programming, and I don't need to be the one to bring that up. And so, of course, if girls have heard that themselves, or, they're bringing up the stereotype themselves because they want to understand it, then absolutely, address it, but you don't need to be the one. And this kind of goes hand in hand with myth busting. You don't need to be the one. And I often would want to motivate the girls to be like, oh, you can just be just as good as the boys. And that is not, now I've learned that is not the way to go after it. But I can, when girls wonder, does anybody, do women do these kind of things? I have so many role models and famous examples and things that I can bring up that point. And you could even, you can bring them up as part of your workshop as a whole. Just make sure that you're not bringing them up to bust a myth. All right, so pigeonholing. This is when you are assigning roles, and you might be going into small groups and things like that. So you just want to make sure that you divide the labor and assign groups with an explicit systematic process. So random is a process. Making sure if there's going to be feedback time and stuff like that, that every participant gets a chance to share. If they don't want to share, that's fine, but just making sure that even those that might be more shy or less prone to speak up, just making sure that you're continually giving those opportunities. And then avoid assigning based on experience or volunteers. So again, you're going to have a wide variety of experience levels in your workshops, and it's great for those folks to take on the role of a peer mentor and things like that. But you just, you want everybody to experience all parts of your workshop. So you want to make sure that you're allowing for that. And imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome happens when someone doubts their skills, talents, or accomplishments and feels like a fraud despite external evidence to the contrary. And because computer science is such a new field, there are many stereotypes about it and ways that imposter syndrome can get triggered. So one thing to do is, helping students see the evidence of their success. And also, again, because you're going to have students at different levels, just because somebody is better at whatever, whether it's coding or, designing or whatever it is, than somebody else or somebody, they feel that way. They might have more experience doing it. They might have been doing it for longer. So, avoiding those kind of comparisons or helping the participants avoid those kind of comparisons is good. And the final is to reduce differential preparation. I'd say this, is more a classroom environment kind of thing, but when you're designing a workshop, you're bringing your experiences, your background. And if you happen to be like me, a white female, you're bringing a majority sort of culture to the table. And so you need to make sure that you're thinking about where the participants are coming from. So this is really interesting, being aware of potential differences of spatial reasoning, because spatial reasoning is involved quite a bit in the computer science and STEM fields. And it turns out Spatial reasoning is mostly learned through play. So, you don't have, spatial reasoning is not really incorporated into curriculum. And this kind of play is building with blocks, playing video games, doing things like that. And not everybody has access to those things or thinks they have interest in it because maybe of stereotypes. And so just being aware that there might be differences there. And finally, you want to be careful about the allusions and vocabulary you use when explaining CS and STEM concepts, because not everybody has that background or that home culture that, speaks that sort of lingo. And, especially in the computer science and technology field, there's so much lingo that can be gatekeeping and barriers to entry. So we just need to make sure we're careful about that. So there is a little Equitable Teaching Strategies quiz you can take to see how well I explained this. And finally, we're hoping, we want you to pick one strategy that you'll employ. You can certainly employ more than one, but one that you're kind of going to focus on, because we want to hear how that went. So thank you and good luck.